children featured in this video. So if that's not your thing, totally okay. I will catch you next time. But this is the case of the MacDonald family massacre. My good friend Haylee over on the Empress ASMR covered, I think it was the Van Breeden family murders, and that case threw me for a loop, guys, so definitely go check it out. But it got me researching like family casualties, and this is the case that I discovered and researched for you guys. So let's just get right into it. Jeffrey MacDonald was born in Queens, New York, and he was the second of 3 children. His parents were Robert and Dorothy MacDonald. Jeffrey was raised in a poor household on Long Island with a disciplinarian father who, though he wasn't physically violent towards his family, he demanded obedience and achievements from his family. Jeffrey attended, I always mess these names up, Patchogue Medford High School, where he became the president of the student council. He was voted both most popular and most likely to succeed by his fellow classmates, and he was the king of the senior prom. Towards the end of his 8th grade year, I know I'm backtracking a little, but stick with me, Jeffrey became acquainted with a woman named Colette Catherine Stevenson. He would later say that when he first observed Colette walking down the hallway with her best friend, that although he was attracted to both of them, he found Colette more attractive. Approximately 2 weeks later, they began talking and formed a friendship, with Jeffrey soon asking Colette to the movies. The two formed a briefly romantic relationship in the 9th grade, with Jeffrey later saying that they fell in love while holding hands on the balcony, watching a movie called A Summer Place at the Rialto Theater. He would later say that whenever he and Colette heard the song, a theme from A Summer Place, across the airwaves, either one of them would immediately turn up the radio. That following summer, while visiting a friend on Fire Island, Colette announced to Jeffrey that she wanted to break up. So Jeffrey wasn't terribly devastated by this because he pretty quickly formed a relationship with a woman named Penny. Jeffrey's high school grades were sufficient enough to earn him a 3-year scholarship at Princeton University, where he enrolled as a pre-medical student in 1962. By the second year of his college studies, Jeffrey and Penny had broken up, and he soon resumed his romantic relationship with Colette. She was then a freshman at Skidmore College in Sarasota Springs. Colette had grown into a shy young woman with a slight fear of the world in general, and she would rely on Jeffrey's self-confidence. He found her kind of timidity touching, and he kind of viewed himself as her protector in some ways. There we go. Sorry, I lost my place. The two of them regularly exchanged letters, and Jeffrey would frequently, and I found this so weird, but then I thought, well, he would hitchhike to Skidmore College to be in her company on the weekends. In 1960, undergraduate degree at Princeton, Jeffrey briefly worked as a construction supervisor before he moved with his wife and child to Chicago in the summer of 1965, where he had been accepted at Northwestern University Medical School. The three, moved into a small one-bedroom apartment. Colette was committed to maintaining the household and raising their daughter as Jeffrey focused on his studies, while also working a series of part-time jobs to assist with the family finances. The following year, the family relocated to a middle-class neighborhood, and their second daughter, Kristen Jean, was born May 8th, 1967. Shortly after Jeffrey graduated from medical school in 1968, the four of them relocated to Bergenfeld, New Jersey, as he then completed a one-year internship at the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, specializing in thoracic surgery. Jeffrey later described his internship year as horrendous for both himself and Colette, adding that he frequently worked 36 hours with only 12 hours at home. Consequently, when he was at home, he was exhausted, and he had pretty limited interactions with his wife and daughters. When he completed this internship, he and Colette vacationed in Aruba before Jeffrey decided to join the Army. He enlisted in the United States Army on June 28, 1969, and he was sent to Fort Sam, Houston, Texas, to undergo a 6 weeks physician basic training course. While at Fort Sam, Houston, he volunteered to be assigned to the Army's Special Forces, or the Green Berets, to become a Special Forces physician. He was then assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, where he completed their paratrooper training. Now, Jeffrey had joined the Army knowing he might be deployed to serve in the Vietnam War. He later learned that, as a Green Beret doctor, he was very unlikely to serve overseas. In late August, he reported to the 3rd Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to serve as the group's surgeon. He was followed by his wife and children, and the MacDonald family resided at 5044 Castle Drive, in a section of the base reserved for married officers, and they were afforded security by military police. The couple quickly became popular among their neighbors, although Jeffrey and Colette were known to have argued occasionally, but what couple doesn't? By the time the MacDonalds had moved into their apartment at Fort Bragg, Colette had accrued 2 years of studies, with aspirations to obtain a bachelor's degree in English literature and teach part-time. Both daughters had developed a distinctive personalities. Now, Kimberly was markedly feminine, intelligent, and shy, and Kristen was a boisterous tomboy who would run right in and crack somebody if she observed her older sister being bullied by other children. On December 10th, the 3rd Special Forces Group was deactivated, and Jeffrey was transferred on base to headquarters to serve as a preventative medical officer. Shortly before Christmas in 1969, with his wife approximately 3 months pregnant with their 3rd child and their first son, Jeffrey MacDonald bought his daughters, added an R, a Shetland pony. They were anticipating that their family would soon relocate to a farm in Connecticut, so he kept this purchase a secret from his wife and children, and he and his stepfather-in-law drove them to the stable as a surprise on Christmas Day. His daughters chose to name this pony Trooper, and that same month, Colette is known to have written a letter to a college acquaintance in which she described her life as never being normal or happy, adding that to feed and ride the pony that he'd purchased for them. The three then returned home at about 5:45 p.m. Jeffrey then took a shower and changed into a pair of blue pajamas. After a quick dinner with Colette and the girls, quick because Colette was headed off to child psychology class, he then put Kristen to bed, and worn out by the 24-hour shift he'd worked the day before, moonlighting at a civilian hospital, he fell asleep on the living room floor while watching television. An hour later, Kimberly woke him up and asked if they could watch her favorite show, a TV program called Laugh In. She went to bed when the show was over, and about 40 minutes later, Colette came home. The two of them sat on the couch watching television before Colette decided to go to bed, midway through The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. Jeffrey himself fell asleep in the living room in the early morning hours of the following day. At 3:42 a.m. on February 17, 1970, dispatchers at Fort Bragg received an emergency phone call from Jeffrey MacDonald. He faintly spoke into the receiver. "Help! 544 Castile Drive. Stabbing. 544 Castile Drive. Stabbing. Hurry." The operator then heard the sound of the receiver clatter against the wall or the floor. Within 10 minutes, responding military police arrived at the address, initially believing that they were responding to like a domestic disturbance. They found the front door closed and locked, and the house dark on the inside. When no one answered the door, they circled to the back of the house, where a police sergeant discovered the back screen door closed, unlocked, and the back door wide open. Upon entering, the sergeant walked into the master bedroom before running to the front of the house, shouting, "Tell them to get Womack ASAP." Colette MacDonald was discovered sprawled on the floor of the master bedroom in the MacDonald home. She lay on her back with one eye opened and her chest exposed. She had been repeatedly hit about her body, with both forearms later found to be broken. The pathologist would note that these wounds had likely been inflicted as she had raised her arms to protect her face. In addition to these wounds, she had also been stabbed 21 times in the chest with what appeared to be an ice pick, and 16 times about the neck and chest with a different object that appeared to be a knife. Her trachea had been severed in 2 places. A bloody and torn pajama top was draped across her, and a paring knife lay next to her body. Beside her, Jeffrey MacDonald was found lying face down. He was alive, but wounded. He had his head on Colette and one arm around her neck. As military personnel approached him, he whispered, "Check on my kids. I heard my kids crying." Now this is where I talk about the kids, so if you want to skip forward, totally fine. 5-year-old Kimberly was found in her bed. She had been repeatedly bludgeoned about her head and neck, and she had been stabbed between 8 and 10 times. She lay on her left side, and her skull had been fractured from at least 2 blows to the right side of her little head. She had a wound to her face that actually caused her cheekbone to break through her skin. The wounds to Kimberly's head were severe in nature, and they caused bruising to her brain, coma, and then death soon after infliction. Across the hallway, 2-year-old Kristen was also in her bed, lying on her left side, with a baby bottle close to her mouth. She had been stabbed 33 times across the neck, chest, hands, and back with a knife, and 15 times with the ice pick. 2 of the wounds torso. This wound was described by a staff surgeon as a clean, small, sharp incision, measuring 5/8 of an inch in depth, and this had caused Jeffrey's lung to partially collapse. He was released from the hospital after 9 days. When questioned by the Criminal Investigation Division, or the CID, Jeffrey claimed that at about 2 a.m. on February 17th, he had washed the evening's dinner dishes before deciding to go to bed, although his younger daughter Kristen had wet his side of the bed, so he had taken her to her own bed. And he didn't want to wake Colette up as she was pregnant and tired, so he had taken a blanket from Kristen's room and fallen asleep on the living room couch. Jeffrey said he was later awakened by Colette and Kimberly's screams. Colette was shouting, "Jeff, Jeff, help! Why are they doing this to me?" As he rose from the couch to go to their aid, he was attacked by 3 male intruders. 2 of them Caucasian, and 1 of them African American. The shorter of the 2 Caucasian men wore lightweight, possibly surgical gloves. A 4th intruder he described as a white female with long blonde hair, maybe even a wig, and she was wearing high-heeled knee-high boots and a white floppy hat that partially covered her face. This individual creepily stood nearby with a candle, chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." Jeffrey claimed that the 3 males then attacked him with a club and an ice pick, with the female intruder shouting, "Hit him again." During the struggle, his pajama top was pulled over his head to his wrists, and he used this garment to ward off thrusts from the ice pick, although eventually he was overcome by his assailants and knocked unconscious in the living room. When he regained consciousness, the intruders were gone. He had then stumbled from room to room, attempting to give CPR to each of his daughters, before discovering his wife. He had then pulled the small paring knife from Colette's chest, which he tossed onto the floor. He attempted in vain to find her pulse, and then draped his pajama top over her body. And then he called for help. Within minutes of the discoveries at Castle Drive, military police were instructed to check the occupants of all the vehicles in and around Fort Bragg. They were seeking the 2 white men, the 1 black man, and the white woman with the long blonde hair. They were trying to apprehend these 4 intruders. Jeffrey alleged that it attacked him and his family. Now, despite these efforts, military police failed to locate them, and the initiative was abandoned by 6 a.m. Shortly after daylight on February 17th, investigators recovered the murder weapons just outside the back door of the MacDonald home. These instruments were an old hickory kitchen knife, an ice pick, and a 31-inch long piece of lumber with 2 blue threads attached by blood. All 3 of these items were quickly determined to have come from the MacDonald household, and they had all been wiped clean of fingerprints. residence in the early hours of the morning. But they had heard Colette shouting in a loud and angry voice. The 16-year-old daughter of these neighbors, who occasionally babysat for the MacDonald family, informed investigators that the two seemed kind of taciturn and indifferent towards each other in the month prior to the murders. By February 23rd, Colonel Robert Korenick, the Fort Bragg Provost Marshal, had advised the FBI to discontinue their search for the 4 intruders. In addition to a lack of damage inside the house, no fibers from Jeffrey's torn pajama top were found in the living room, where he claimed the garment had been torn in his struggle with the intruders. However, fibers from the pajama top were found beneath Colette's body and in the bedrooms of both of his daughters. In fact, one fiber from this garment was also found beneath 2-year-old Kristen's fingernail. A single fragment of skin was recovered from beneath one of Colette's fingernails, although this evidence was later misplaced. Blood-stained splinters, likely sourced from the piece of lumber I talked about earlier, were recovered close to the back door of the apartment, and the splinters were recovered in all 3 bedrooms of this apartment, but not the room where Jeffrey claimed to have been attacked. No blood or fingerprints were found on either telephone, after Jeffrey said he had to call for help after checking each of his family members and attempting to resuscitate them. Furthermore, the blood-stained tip of a surgical glove was found beneath the headboard where the word pig had been written. This glove was identical in comparison to a medical supply that Jeffrey invariably kept in the family kitchen. I also do that. Although it had rained the night of February 16th, early 17th, and Jeffrey had claimed that the female intruder's boots were wet with rainwater just dripping off of them, the sole footprint observed at the scene was a bloody bare footprint in Kristen's bedroom, leading from the child's bed in the direction of the doorway. By mid-March, the CID had obtained the results of the forensic testing from the blood, hair, and fiber samples from 544 Castile Drive, and they contradicted Jeffrey's accounts of his movements and further convinced investigators of his guilt. For example, Kimberly's blood was also found on his pajama top, even though Jeffrey had said he wasn't wearing this while attempting to resuscitate her. His own blood was located in significant quantities in only 2 locations, in front of a kitchen cabinet containing rubber gloves, and upon the right side of the bathroom hallway sink. Investigators also questioned why Colette's blood was found in Kristen's room, although all 3 victims were found in separate bedrooms. This did suggest that they were attacked separately. Moreover, although blood evidence indicated Kimberly had been attacked as she entered the master bedroom, investigators questioned why home intruders would bother to carry her back to her own bedroom to continue their attack. The 4 members of the MacDonald family had 4 different blood types. This was a statistical anomaly that assisted investigators in determining the movements of each member of the family. Their subsequent theory is the likely scenario of unfolding events. Upon the assumption that the 4 individuals discovered by responding military police were the only 4 people in the house, the early morning hours of February 17th, investigators were able to reconstruct a likely scenario chain of events that had unfolded via this blood typing and the nature and severity of the wounds discovered upon each individual. So this is how the police think it actually went. An argument or fight between Jeffrey Kristen's repeatedly wetting his side of the bed while sleeping there, or Jeffrey's adultery. Investigators speculated that the argument turned physical, and she had probably hit him in the forehead with a hairbrush, which resulted in the mark on his forehead that failed to break the skin. As he retaliated by hitting her, first with his fists and then with the piece of lumber, Kimberly, whose blood was found in the doorway, may have walked in after hearing the commotion, and she was struck at least once on the head, possibly by accident. Believing Colette dead, Jeffrey then carried Kimberly back to her bedroom. After stabbing her, he proceeded to Kristen's room, carrying the club that he had used on Kimberly and Colette, intent of disposing on the last potential remaining witness. Now, before he could do so, Colette, whose blood was found on Kristen's bed covers and on one wall of her bedroom, apparently regained consciousness, stumbled into her younger daughter's bedroom, and threw herself on top of Kristen in a desperate attempt to save her baby. After killing both of them, Jeffrey then wrapped Colette's body in a sheet, carried her back to the master bedroom, leaving the smudged footprint by Kristen's doorway. CDI investigators then theorized that Jeffrey attempted to cover up the murders using articles on the Manson family murders that he recently read in the March 1970 issue of Esquire that investigators found in the living room. Remember that stack of magazines I mentioned? He then put on surgical gloves from the kitchen cabinet, went to the master bedroom, where he used Colette's blood to write "pig" on the headboard. He then laid his torn pajama top over her body, and then repeatedly stabbed her with the ice pick. He discarded the weapons close to the back door after properly wiping them clean of fingerprints. Then he took a scalpel blade from the supply closet, entered the adjacent bathroom, stabbed himself once in the chest while standing beside the sink before disposing of the surgical gloves. He then used the family phone to summon an ambulance before laying down beside Colette's body as he waited for military police to arrive. On April 6, 1970, Army investigators formally cautioned and then interrogated Jeffrey MacDonald. He was, of course, first offered the chance to recount his version of events. He recounted his claims of being attacked with the 4 intruders with whom he grappled with before falling to the ground, observing some of the tops of boots, then being unconscious and then conscious, experiencing symptoms of a collapsed lung in the hallway after intruders had left. Investigators were pretty unconvinced of Jeffrey's accounts, and midway through the questioning, he was asked a question about his stab wounds by a CDI investigator named William Ivory. "You did it yourself, didn't you?" This question prompted Jeffrey to deny the accusation, before referencing his puncture wound and his having to persuade hospital doctors to insert a chest tube into his body as he was sure that his lung was punctured. Questioning then focused upon the crime scene and the results of the forensic testing. Jeffrey denied knowing any of the murder weapons had come from his household, despite the fact that the section of lumber matched a piece of wood from Kimberly's closet. He also claimed to be unaware of how the fiber and blood evidence contraindicated his accounts of his movements and actions. Investigator Robert Shaw then questioned Jeffrey as to the lack of disorder and damage within the household and the lack of any motive, stating that with investigators' experience, had four intruders embarked on a murderous frenzy within a small household, they would have expected to encounter evidence such as busted furniture, broken mirrors, bashed in walls. But the only signs of a unaware as to how Kimberly's blood had been recovered from the master bedroom. Investigators took a short break and resumed questioning that same afternoon. Investigator Franz Grebner further listed physical evidence and discrepancies between Jeffrey's account and the forensic evidence, repeatedly stating that all of the facts pointed to Jeffrey having staged the crime scene. Jeffrey was unable to offer a plausible explanation to this before abruptly accusing Grebner of having run out of ideas and attempting to frame him to maintain a 100% solved homicide rate. In response, Grebner stated, "We have all this business here that would tend to indicate that you were involved in this, rather than the people came into the home from the outside and picked 544 Castle Drive, went up there and were lucky enough to find your door open." When investigators asked Jeffrey to submit to a polygraph test to verify his accounts, he readily agreed to this. Although within 10 minutes of the conclusion of his questioning session, he then called investigators in to state that he had changed his mind, and he would not submit to any polygraph testing. On the evening of April 6th, Jeffrey MacDonald was relieved of his duties with the United States Army, and he was placed under further restriction, pending further inquiries. The following day, he was assigned an Army lawyer. At the recommendation of his mother, on April 10th, he instead hired a flamboyant civilian defense attorney named Bernard Seagal to defend him. Less than 1 month later, on May 1st, the Army formally charged Jeffrey MacDonald with 3 counts of murder. That same day, Jeffrey wrote a letter to Colette's mother and stepfather professing his innocence, emphasizing that the Army would never admit their error, and he speculated that his wife's soul may hold infinite patience and understanding of his current legal predicament. An initial Army Article 32 hearing into Jeffrey's possible guilt was overseen by Colonel Warren Rock, convened on July 6th, 1970. This hearing lasted until September. I gotta take a water break. Jeffrey's lawyer Bernard adopted an offensive strategy on behalf of his client at this hearing, citing numerous examples of incompetence on witnesses claimed Stockley had admitted her involvement in the murders, with several also remembering her wearing this floppy hat, similar to being described by Jeffrey. She was not subpoenaed to testify in his trial. Jeffrey testified for 3 days mid-August. Sections of his testimony contradicted what he had informed investigators that prior questioning on April 6th, including his claim on this occasion to have actually moved Colette's body, having found her a little bit propped up against a chair before he sort of laid her flat on the floor for resuscitation. He also stated that possibly because of his surgical background, he maybe sort of had rinsed off his hands as he checked his own injuries in the bathroom before he called for help, and that's why there was no blood on the phone. Referencing the type B blood type found in the kitchen, he said that he may have also washed his hands in the kitchen for some reason prior to making that phone call. I'm gonna need you to pick a place, Jeffrey. Now, contrary to medical reports and his earlier accounts, he also claimed to have located 2 bumps on the back of his head and 2 or 3 puncture wounds in his upper left chest, other wounds to his right arm, and approximately 10 ice pick wounds to his abdomen, all of which healed without any treatment, and none of which required any surgery of any kind. When he was questioned in regards to his infidelity that they may or may not have been fighting about, Jeffrey admitted, yes, he had been unfaithful on 2 prior occasions, but Colette had not known about either of these. He also claimed that their time at Fort Bragg had been the most content of their married life. Jeffrey's testimony was followed by that of a clinical psychologist who testified to a conclusion of a series of tests that he conducted on Jeffrey. This expert believed that the test revealed an extraordinary absence of anxiety, depression, or anger in Jeffrey in regard to the loss of his whole family, and that his report concluded that he was able to muster massive denial or regression to such a degree that the impact of recent events in his life had been blunted. Furthermore, this extreme psychological response would likely see an individual convey himself as, every time I'm telling you, victimized and perhaps somewhat of a martyr. To the chagrin of Colonel Granick, on October 13th, 1970, Colonel Rock issued a report recommending that the charges be dismissed against Jeffrey MacDonald as insufficient evidence existed to prove his guilt, adding his belief that no truth existed in these charges and the nature of the murders led him to believe that the perpetrators either were insane or under the influence of drugs. Rock also recommended that the civilian authorities further investigate Stockley, the girl with the floppy hat. Later that same month, all charges were formally dismissed, although a new CID investigation tasked with finding the murders was assembled in February of 1971, with Jeffrey still considered a suspect in this case. In December, Jeffrey received an honorable discharge from the Army, and he initially returned to New York, where he briefly worked as a doctor before relocating to Long Beach, California in July of 1971, in an effort to put the past behind him and distance himself from the constant reminders of his wife and daughters. Jeffrey started over a new life in the California sun as an emergency room doctor. He purchased a luxury condominium, a sports car, and a yacht. Colette's stepfather, Freddie Kassab, was at first like a staunch supporter of Jeffrey's innocence, but he then later became convinced of Jeffrey's guilt, and he crusaded for this case to be reopened. And he managed to get it done. Jeffrey was indicted by a federal 1975 for the 3 murders. One key piece of evidence during this trial was Jeffrey's pajama top, riddled with 48 punctures, 12 times the number of wounds in his body, but matching the number of wounds in Colette's chest. Jeffrey had claimed it had been ripped off while struggling with the intruders, and he had used it to ward off blows, but laboratory tests match fibers and threads from the pajamas to the piece of lumber that was used as a club and stained with blood. The fibers and threads were scattered through the bedrooms as well, remember? Prosecutors speculated that his rampage followed this argument with Colette that had just spiraled. Jeffrey realized he was at the point of no return, and he had to eliminate all of the witnesses. As I said before, they surmised the same thing. After killing both daughters, he covered Colette with the pajama top, stabbed her through the fabric, possibly to bolster his story. This jury convicted Jeffrey MacDonald on August 29th, 1979 on 3 counts of murder. He appealed, and he was released in 1980 after the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that he was denied the right to a speedy trial. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed that decision in 1982. In 2012, defense lawyers tried to introduce new DNA evidence, which wasn't available during his original trial. 3 of the human hairs found at 544 Castle Drive. These hairs did not match Jeffrey or any of the victims. He also sought to include evidence from a U.S. deputy marshal who claimed Stockley told him in '79 that a prosecutor threatened her with a murder indictment if she testified that she was in fact inside the MacDonald home the night of the murders. A U.S. District Court and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal judge rejected requests for a retrial in 2014 and again in 2018. And from what I can tell, there are no pending appeals right now. Veteran North Carolina defense attorney James P. Cooney III works with the Innocence Project, who uses DNA testing to free the wrongly convicted. When he was asked if Jeffrey would be a good candidate, he says, "I'm just not sure if he would," in the sense that with the Innocence Project, what you're really looking for is good, solid forensic evidence that will include or exclude someone. Jeffrey's story continues to be paradoxical. He notes, he's less wounded than his wife and daughters, even though he's in more of a struggle. How does that happen? The perpetrators, why don't they kill him? Why are they killing 2-year-old baby Kristen instead? If the group that MacDonald claimed murdered his family resembled the Manson crew, they wouldn't just fade into oblivion. They would strike again. 4 strangers coming in, it doesn't make a lot of sense. They aren't stealing anything. There's no sign of forced entry. What is evident, Cooney says, is that there's a lot of rage and hate at that crime scene. So, Jeffrey was sentenced to prison. He is, in fact, still in prison. He has since gotten remarried. He was approached by this woman that had read all about this case, and she really felt like she could help him, and she is like constantly trying to find evidence and trying to get him out of prison. They, in fact, tried to appeal that since he was so old now, that he shouldn't be in a prison now because of COVID, and I don't know. I don't really know. I fully believe that this guy did this with all of the He was eligible for parole in March of 1991, but he did not apply for parole at that time. At the urging of his second wife and his attorneys, he applied for a May 2005 parole hearing, and his request was immediately denied. His next potential parole hearing was in May of 2020, but I couldn't find out if he applied for parole on that date. Jeffrey Mitchell, the boyfriend who Elena accused of murdering Colette, died, and Stockley has also passed away. So if they were involved in any way, they probably took their secrets with them to the grave. Colette's parents both died in 1994, and they were completely under the conviction that Jeffrey had committed this crime. Sometimes these family massacres are so difficult. I have such a hard time when it comes to little kids. It is very hard for me to understand why grown men feel it necessary